Tehran is threatening to stop complying with the key requirement of an international nuclear agreement, but says European powers still have the time to save the deal. Now, it says it's ramping up enrichment of low-grade uranium and will exceed the limit it's allowed to stockpile in just 10 days if European countries don't find a way to protect Iran from crippling US sanctions. So we'll go live to our report in just a few minutes. But first, Frederik Pleitgen tells us more about Iran's effort to turn up the pressure on European powers.
As tensions between the U.S. and Iran escalate after the attacks on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman, Iran also announcing it's scaling back its commitments under the nuclear agreement, drastically accelerating production of low-grade enriched uranium.
I have said that we are counting down. In 10 days' time, we will overpass, of course, the limitation of keeping 300 kilograms of stockpiles of LEU enriched uranium inside the country. And of course, there would be other measures later on if the Europeans will not do their parts.
Iran wants European countries to make good on their commitments under the deal to provide Iran with economic relief in the face of tough U.S. sanctions. Iran's oil exports have been all but cut off by the Trump administration's policy of maximum pressure, and the U.S. reiterating its claims that Iran was behind the tanker attack last week near the Strait of Hormuz.
It's unmistakable what happened here. These were attacks by the Islamic Republic of Iran on commercial shipping on the freedom of navigation with a clear intent to deny transit through the strait.
Iran verbally firing back, a senior official now saying Tehran believes the U.S. may have committed the attacks. On the streets of Tehran, a mix of concern and defiance. There is a fear among the people that there might be war, this man says, but our people would like to have stability and peace. America is nothing, this woman says. Whenever we talk, they don't answer us properly. There's no point in talking to them. Of course, there are some fears, this woman says, but we hope that the United States will moderate its hard line, and I hope our government will be more flexible so they can come to terms with each other and achieve peace. But so far, neither side seems willing to back down, both the U.S. and Iran saying they don't want war, but demanding the other side make the first move towards de-escalation. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Tehran.
We are covering these developments as only CNN can. Fred Pleitgen joins us now live from Tehran. Atika Schubert is in London and Sam Kiley is in Abu Dhabi. And Freddie, I want to start with you, if I may, because this is yet another blow to the nuclear deal that was signed back in 2015. But put it into context for our viewers right around the world. What is Iran's intent here? Is it to power the country or to build a bomb?
I think for the Iranians, it's absolutely to, I wouldn't necessarily say to power the country, but I do think that they want to have the benefits of nuclear energy, on the one hand, to power some of the country, but also for research purposes as well. And on the other hand, of course, for them, the nuclear agreement, Issa, was also extremely important because for them, it was supposed to provide sanctions relief. And right now, what's going on, or what the Iranians say is going on, is that they're adhering to this nuclear agreement. They're putting curbs on their nuclear program in a massive way, but they're not getting any of the benefits. They say, look, there's no companies that are investing here in Iran because of U.S. sanctions pressure, and they're not able to sell at least most of their oil on international markets, and the Iranians are saying that needs to stop. So they're putting a lot of pressure on the Europeans because they know that the Iranians and the Europeans are on the same page on this issue. Both sides want the nuclear agreement to survive, and on a different page, of course, than the Trump administration, which has already pulled out of the nuclear agreement. And the Iranians are saying, look, if you guys think the nuclear agreement is important, Europeans, if you want it to survive, you're going to have to start putting real things in place to make sure your companies can do business here in Iran. Otherwise, for the Iranians, this deal simply isn't worth keeping around, Issa.
Well, let's get the European reaction. Fred, do stay with us, as well as Sam Kiley. Atika, you're joining me here. We heard from Federica Mogherini, the EU foreign minister. What did she have to say? Did she see these comments from Iran, Atika, as a threat at all?
Well, she refused to be drawn on this. She wasn't going to be baited. She didn't draw any red lines. She said, for now, Iran is sticking to the agreement. Take a listen to what she said.
at the moment, as of today, Iran is still compliant, and we strongly hope, encourage, expect that Iran continues to comply with its commitments under the JCPOA in full. And I would not enter into a blame game at all. So our focus is not to enter into a blame game or giving responsibility for a collapse of a deal that might come. Our focus is to keep the agreement in place.
So basically she's saying, listen, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. In the meantime, you know, Germany, France, and the UK have all been working to try and put into place what's called INSTEX. This is this financial trade workaround to the U.S. sanctions. And Germany's foreign minister, Heiko Maas, was there last week in Tehran trying to make it work. So there was some hope that maybe we could see the first transactions coming, but so far we haven't seen anything solid.
Let's on that, because Iran that basically said they've given us a lot of good words, this is from Iran, but not deeds, talking about Europe. Why is it taking Europe so long?
Well, this is a really tricky thing to do. I mean, the U.S. has said essentially any trade with Iran, barring humanitarian needs, is completely out. These sanctions are tough, and they're going to get tougher. And Europe has been saying, well, maybe we can find some sort of a currency workaround where with the trade only between the EU and Iran. But that's tricky to do with such a dominant economy like the U.S. And so it's taken a lot of time to set up this mechanism. They haven't had the first transaction in it yet. And even once they get the first transaction, it's only going to be in pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, those things that the United States sees as, you know, necessary for humanitarian reasons. They're not getting into the big trades yet. And I think that's why Iran is getting really frustrated, saying you made all these promises for trade and now they're falling through.
And what we heard today, in fact, Sam, from Iran was the fact they are feeling the pinch. All this coming just days after suspected attacks against 2 foreign tankers in the Gulf of Oman. We heard that report from Frederik Pleitgen. So mistrust between both countries clearly an all-time high. Now, you've just written a piece, Sam, for CNN.com, and you say in your piece, Iran benefits the most from these increasing tensions. Explain to our viewers why.
Well, it's a bit counterintuitive, but that makes it a bit more fun. Now, essentially, if the Iranians can leave the impression, without being formally, legally blamed, that they can close the Straits of Hormuz with a relatively low investment of some limpet mines, and they've already had a material effect on shipping through those straits. There's been a 10 times increase in insurance rate, I'm told, by 2 different companies involved in shipping through that location. There's pressure now on the Royal Navy and other international naval forces there to help out and advise ships as they go through. They can conjure up memories of the tanker wars in the 1980s when the US Navy was involved in protecting shipping, Iraqi shipping mostly, from being attacked from the Iranians and driving up oil prices and insurance rates and so on. So for a relatively low investment and no blame, they've been able to send this signal that they can have material effect on the well-being, particularly of the Europeans. Remember, a quarter of the European Union's exports goes to the Gulf. That's countries like this one I'm sitting in the UAE. So closing down that kind of route is catastrophic economically for countries in the region and in Europe. If you then combine the issues that you've been discussing with Atika over the JCPOA, you see that what they're doing is threatening a double whammy. And the other thing about the Iranians is that they're also signaling that they can take a lot more pain than the economies in the West. They can take it because they're authoritarian, and they can take it because they have a kind of tradition of doing that. Remember, 1 million people were killed in the Iran-Iraq war. It's not that long ago. So they are sending out these signals that they're robust. They've also got the capacity, using swarms of small, fast boats of the sort that we saw rescuing people from those stricken tankers a few days ago, to even bypass the American military might. If you've got hundreds of these boats all coming at literally at a rate of knots towards battleships, some would get through. So they are signaling that they've got some power, and therefore it's necessary to talk to them. Ultimately, they want to be able to dial down on the sanctions that the US have imposed unilaterally, much to the irritation and despair of the American allies in Europe.
And finally, I want to bring in, if I can, Frederik Pleitgen very quickly. Fred, you heard what Sam was saying. They're threatening a double whammy. Slightly risky, is it not, for Iran at this stage?
Well, I think that the Iranians at this point in time believe that they're in a position where they're essentially calling the Trump administration's bluff. The Iranians have been saying for quite a while they believe that there are people in the Trump administration, like, for instance, the National Security Advisor John Bolton and, for instance, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who are driving the administration towards a war with Iran. But they fundamentally still believe that President Trump himself, while he wants to keep this sanctions pressure upright, does not want a war with Iran. And it's something that the Iranians themselves have said as well. They don't want this to escalate into any sort of war. But at the same time, and Sam is absolutely right in saying that, they say that they are ready for one if it does happen. Not just because of the military power that they have, but first and foremost because of all the militias that they control in the greater Middle East. Issa, one of the things that a senior former Revolutionary Guard commander told me not too long ago, he said, look, the Americans need to understand, if this comes to a shooting war, it's not just the armies against one another. They say that next to every military base that the U.S. has in the Middle East, there is an Iranian militia that, or a pro-Iranian militia that can be mobilized very quickly. So the Iranians clearly saying they do have a lot of power in this as well. And today, even, interestingly, the chief of Iran's general staff came out and said, look, if we wanted to close the Strait of Hormuz, that's certainly something we could do. We could do it openly if we wanted to. But the Iranians at this point are saying they don't want this to escalate. They certainly don't want to close the Strait of Hormuz. They say they want to keep it open because they themselves say they feel responsible, and they are responsible for the security of the shipping that goes through there, at least in parts of the Strait of Hormuz, and of course in general in the Persian Gulf as well.